believe what happened at this high-end restaurant. It was supposed to be a night of fine dining, luxury, and exclusivity. But when a group of racist cops decided a black man didn't belong there, everything took a turn for the worse. The tension was thick. People raised their voices. And just when things were about to spiral out of control, Keanu Reeves stepped in. What happened next left everyone in the restaurant stunned. The cops? They weren't ready for this. The restaurant staff? They didn't expect the tables to turn. And the man they were harassing? He got justice in the most unforgettable way. This isn't just another Hollywood story. This is real, raw, and proof that one person can make a difference. If you love gripping, real-life stories that expose the truth and make you believe in justice, subscribe to Storygram now. We bring you stories like this every day, and you won't want to miss what happens next. Los Angeles. Saturday night. The kind of evening where the rich and famous fill the most exclusive restaurants in town, sipping aged wine and talking about things that only the ultra-wealthy understand. Inside the restaurant, one of the city's most prestigious dining spots, everything was polished to perfection. Marble floors gleamed under the golden chandeliers, waiters moved with precision, and soft jazz played in the background, setting the mood for an elegant night. The restaurant was packed, tables full. The scent of truffle risotto and seared steak filled the air. At one table, a well-dressed black man sat alone, quietly enjoying his meal. He wasn't flashy, wasn't loud, just a man who had worked hard and was treating himself to an evening of fine dining. His name? David Carter, a lawyer, a man who had built his success from the ground up. He didn't notice the looks at first, the subtle stares from certain patrons, the hushed whispers between the waiters. But then, the mood changed. Two off-duty police officers entered the restaurant. They weren't in uniform, but the way they carried themselves, arrogant, entitled, ready to throw their weight around, made it obvious. One of them, a broad-shouldered man with a crew cut, spotted David across the room. He smirked and nudged his partner. "Look at that," he muttered, just loud enough for the hostess to hear. "Didn't think this place took walk-ins from the other side of town." The hostess didn't react. She had heard that tone before. She knew what was coming. David, meanwhile, was finishing his wine, oblivious to the storm about to hit. The cops took a seat at the bar. One of them, Officer Rick Dalton, waved over a waiter. "Hey," he said, nodding towards David. "What's the deal with that guy?" The waiter hesitated. "I'm not sure what you mean, sir." Dalton smirked. "You sure he's supposed to be here? I mean, does he look like a regular?" The waiter stiffened. "Yes, sir. He's a guest, just like anyone else." Dalton glanced at his partner, Officer Tom Grady, who chuckled under his breath. "Relax, kid," Grady said, taking a sip of his whiskey. "We're just asking questions. You know, making sure everything's in order." Everything's in order. That was cop talk for this guy doesn't belong here. David had no idea what was brewing behind him, but the staff did. And the worst part? No one was stopping it. Then, a few minutes later, the waiter came back with the check. David reached for his wallet. And that's when it happened. Dalton and Grady stood up and walked straight to his table. The restaurant went silent. David looked up, confused. And then Dalton said it. "Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to come with us." David blinked, caught off guard. He looked up at the two men standing over him, their faces hard, their stance aggressive. The restaurant had gone eerily silent, forks hovering in midair, conversations cut short. "Excuse me?" he said, his voice calm but firm. Dalton smirked, arms crossed. "We need to ask you a few questions. Outside." David set his napkin down, glancing around. Eyes darted away. No one wanted to get involved. "I'm in the middle of dinner," he said evenly. "If you have something to say it here." Grady let out a low chuckle, shaking his head like David had just made the biggest mistake of his life. "Don't make this difficult," Dalton said, lowering his voice just enough to sound threatening. David knew this game. He'd seen it in court, defended people against it, and watched how it played out. It always started with a conversation. Then it turned into resisting. Then suddenly, someone was in cuffs, and the cops were the victims. "Not tonight." He leaned back, folding his arms. "On what grounds?" Dalton exhaled sharply, clearly not expecting pushback. We got a call about a suspicious individual matching your description. David almost laughed. Matching my description? That old line. Interesting, he said, tilting his head. You got a call about a suspicious person dining alone at an expensive restaurant? Grady tapped his fingers against the table. You're making this harder than it needs to be. No, David said, locking eyes with him. I'm making you do your job properly. The tension in the room thickened. The other diners were pretending not to watch, but David could feel their attention like a spotlight. Then, just as Dalton opened his mouth to push harder, a voice cut through the air. Hey! It was calm, steady, but it carried weight. Dalton and Grady turned, and the entire restaurant followed their gaze. Keanu Reeves stood a few feet away, holding a glass of wine, dressed simply, black jeans, a dark shirt, nothing flashy. He wasn't trying to draw attention, but it didn't matter. His presence was impossible to ignore. He stepped forward casually, eyes locked on the two officers. Something wrong? He asked, voice smooth as silk. Dalton's smirk faltered. His jaw tightened. He knew who this was. Everyone did. Grady recovered first, straightening his shoulders. This isn't your concern. Keanu took another step closer, setting his glass down on a nearby table. Looks like you're making it everyone's concern. Dalton's patience was slipping. This is police business. Keanu glanced at David, then back at the cops. Really? Because it looks like two guys are harassing a man who's trying to enjoy his dinner. David exhaled quietly. Finally, Grady's face darkened. Back off. Keanu smiled. Not a friendly one. A slow, knowing smile. You guys are off duty, right? He asked. Dalton's nostrils flared. Keanu nodded, as if he already knew the answer. So let me get this straight. You're out of uniform. You're drinking. And you just randomly decided to approach a paying customer. Because he what? Doesn't fit your usual crowd? Silence. Grady shifted uncomfortably. Dalton clenched his jaw. You got a badge? Keanu asked. Dalton reached into his pocket, pulling out his wallet and flashing his ID. LAPD. Keanu barely glanced at it. Great. Now show me the official complaint. Dalton hesitated. Keanu shrugged. No. Okay. Then show me the report number. Nothing. Maybe the security footage? More silence. Keanu leaned in slightly. Or maybe this is just two guys trying to flex where they shouldn't. The restaurant felt the shift. Dalton and Grady weren't in control anymore. They were exposed, and they knew it. A waiter cleared his throat nervously. The manager, who had been frozen near the bar, suddenly stepped forward. Is there a problem here? Keanu turned slightly. Yeah, he said. These two gentlemen seem confused about how restaurants work. A few muffled laughs. Someone coughed. Dalton's face burned red. Grady muttered, let's go. Dalton didn't move. His fists were clenched, his pride bruised. But he wasn't stupid. Not here. Not now. He shot David a final glare, then turned and stalked toward the exit. Grady followed, mumbling something under his breath. The second the door swung shut behind them, the tension shattered. A slow murmur spread through the room. People exhaled, some glancing at David with a mix of guilt and relief. Keanu picked up his glass of wine and turned to David. Mind if I join you? David smiled for the first time that night. Please. As Keanu sat down, the manager hurried over, his face pale. Mr. Carter, I am so sorry about that. David waved him off. Not your fault. But maybe next time, speak up a little sooner. The manager swallowed hard, nodding. The waiter returned, flustered, and set down a bottle of their best wine. Compliments of the house. Keanu raised an eyebrow. Look at that. Some people actually know how to handle a situation. David chuckled. He poured 2 glasses, clinking his with Keanu's. To unexpected allies, he said. Keanu smirked. And to calling out Bull. Excuse me. Both men turned. Standing at the entrance was a third cop, and he didn't look happy. The restaurant went dead silent again. Standing in the doorway was Sergeant Bill Hendricks, a seasoned LAPD officer. Unlike the 2 hot-headed off-duty cops who had just slinked out, Hendricks had experience. He carried himself differently, stern, measured, controlled. And he did not look amused. His uniform was crisp. His badge gleamed under the warm restaurant lights. His radio crackled faintly as he took a step forward, scanning the room. His eyes landed on David, then flicked to Keanu, and something in his face hardened. David felt his stomach tighten. This wasn't over. Keanu, on the other hand, leaned back in his chair, unfazed. He casually took a sip of wine and set his glass down like this was just another scene in a movie he had already seen 100 times. The manager wiped his sweaty palms on his apron and stepped forward. "Officer, is there a problem?" Hendricks didn't answer him. He walked straight to the table where Keanu and David sat. He said, looking at David. "Come with me." David exhaled slowly, setting his own glass down. "Are you serious?" Hendricks nodded, his expression unreadable. "You need to come outside." The room was frozen, all eyes darting between them. Keanu tilted his head slightly. "What exactly is this about?" Hendricks kept his gaze locked on David. "You'll find out once we step outside." Keanu chuckled under his breath. "That's a no-go, officer." Hendricks turned his attention to Keanu for the first time. His lips pressed into a thin line. "This doesn't concern you." Keanu raised an eyebrow. "Doesn't it?" He gestured to David. "Because from where I'm sitting, this looks an awful lot like harassment." A ripple of whispers spread across the restaurant. The weight of the moment wasn't lost on anyone. Hendricks squared his shoulders, voice growing sharper. "Mr. Carter was involved in an incident earlier, and I need to clear some things up with him." Keanu smiled like a man who had just heard a bad bluff at a poker table. "Oh, really?" he said. "An incident?" Hendricks' jaw tensed. Keanu folded his hands together on the table, cool and casual. "And tell me, Sergeant, does this so-called incident come with an actual charge? Because if it does, then you should be reading him his rights. But if it doesn't," his eyes darkened, "then what we have here is a very serious problem." The tension was suffocating. David could feel the weight of every stare in the restaurant pressing down on him. He'd been in high-pressure legal situations before, but this was different. Here, in this moment, he wasn't a lawyer. He was just another black man being told to comply without reason. And Keanu knew it. Hendricks exhaled through his nose, clearly frustrated. "Look, I'm not here to argue. Either he comes outside, or I'll have to escort him." Keanu's lips twitched into something that wasn't quite a smile. "Now that sounds like a threat." Hendricks' hand drifted toward his radio. Keanu's voice dropped lower. "I wouldn't do that if I were you." The entire restaurant seemed to inhale at once. David's heart was pounding. He knew this was dangerous. Even in a room full of people, this could turn ugly. But Keanu? He looked completely at ease, like he had all the time in the world. Hendricks was trying to intimidate him, but it wasn't working. Keanu leaned forward slightly, tapping a finger against the table. "You know what's interesting, officer?" he said. Hendricks didn't answer. Keanu continued, his voice razor-sharp. "This entire place has security cameras. High-end ones. They record everything. So right now, the way I see it, you have two options. One, you can give us an actual reason why this man needs to leave with you. Something legally sound. Something that'll hold up in court. Silence. Or two, you can admit that this is just a pathetic attempt to cover for your two buddies who just embarrassed themselves by trying to throw their weight around." A murmur spread through the room. Hendricks' face darkened. Keanu kept going. "And let me remind you, Sergeant, that you're not just dealing with any random customer. You're dealing with an attorney." He gestured to David, "a man who knows his rights." David sat a little straighter, feeling a surge of control return to him. Keanu smirked. "And me? Well, let's just say I have a very large audience who'd love to hear about how a group of off-duty cops tried to pull this nonsense in a public place." More whispers. Someone was filming now. Hendricks' nostrils flared. He was caught. He knew it. He glanced around the room, realizing too late that he wasn't just dealing with an isolated incident anymore. This was bigger. This was public. His fingers flexed against his belt. His jaw tightened. He wanted to fight this, but he had nothing. No charge. No justification. No backup. And Keanu wasn't backing down. Then, just when the tension seemed ready to snap, Hendricks turned and walked out. Just like that. He shoved the door open and disappeared into the night, his boots hitting the pavement hard, his pride in shreds. A second passed, then another, and then the restaurant erupted in quiet applause. It wasn't loud, it wasn't dramatic, but it was real. A few claps at first, then more, until the whole room was acknowledging what had just happened. Keanu turned back to David, expression unreadable. David let out a breath he didn't know he had been holding. Keanu reached for his wine glass and took a slow sip. Then he smiled. That, he said, was some of the best service I've ever seen. David exhaled a laugh, shaking his head. Man, he muttered, you really are the nicest guy in Hollywood. Keanu grinned. I try. Then, just as the moment settled, the restaurant door swung open again. And this time, the chief of police walked in. The restaurant fell into a dead silence again. The chief of police, Robert Kessler, stepped inside. He wasn't like the others. He wasn't some hot-headed patrol officer looking to prove something. He wasn't an off-duty cop trying to throw his weight around. He was the top, the kind of man who didn't show up unless something big was happening. And judging by the way he walked in, deliberate, composed, with that quiet kind of authority that didn't need to be announced, he already knew exactly what kind of mess he was stepping into. David's stomach tightened. Keanu, however, he didn't even blink. Kessler scanned the room, his sharp blue eyes taking in everything. The way people were still sitting tensely, the way the waitstaff had frozen mid-motion, the way Keanu and David were still seated like kings at a table no one dared to touch. Then Kessler spotted the security camera mounted above the bar. His jaw clenched. He adjusted his cufflinks, exhaled slowly, then walked straight over. People shifted in their seats. A few whispered. David could see it in their faces, the same question hanging in the air. Was the chief here to clean this up? To cover for his guys? Or was he here to do the unthinkable? Kessler stopped right next to the table. His gaze landed on Keanu. Then David. He didn't speak right away. He let the silence sit. Let the weight of the moment sink in. Then, in a low, even voice, he said, Mr. Carter, I need to apologize on behalf of my department. The entire restaurant seemed to exhale at once. A waitress actually gasped. Someone near the back of the room muttered, No way. David stared at him. His chest felt tight. He'd been in this game long enough to know this never happened. Cops didn't just walk in and apologize. Not like this. Kessler wasn't finished. I've already seen the footage, he said, voice still level. I know exactly what happened here tonight. And I want to be very clear. His eyes flicked across the room, catching every witness, every phone recording, and every security camera. This was unacceptable. Dalton and Grady weren't here to hear it. Hendricks was long gone. But their failure was hanging in the air like a brand new stain on the LAPD. David could barely process it. Keanu, however, simply nodded, completely unfazed. Good, he said. Kessler studied him for a moment. He wasn't stupid. He knew what this man represented. Not just a celebrity, not just an actor, a man with power. A man who could take this exact story and drop it in front of millions of people overnight. And Kessler? He was just trying to get ahead of the fire before it burned everything down. He turned back to David. Mr. Carter, I'll be handling this personally. You won't have to file a complaint. It's already being done. The officers involved will be put under review, effective immediately. David raised an eyebrow. Under review? Kessler hesitated for a fraction of a second. And likely suspended. Keanu smirked. Getting warmer. Kessler's jaw twitched, but he didn't react. You'll receive a formal statement from my office. And if you choose to take legal action, David crossed his arms. Oh, I will. Kessler nodded once. Then you'll have our full cooperation. David almost laughed. Cooperation. From the LAPD. Now he'd seen everything. Kessler exhaled, then glanced around at the silent, watching crowd. He knew his job wasn't done. This department, he said, voice carrying across the room, will not tolerate incidents like this. Not in this city. Not on my watch. And just like that, The PR damage control was complete. Keanu knew it. David definitely knew it. And yet, it still mattered. Because this time, the LAPD had been forced to say it out loud. David's entire life had been built around the fight for justice. And he knew that one apology didn't fix a broken system. But this moment, it was something. The chief adjusted his cufflinks one last time. "Enjoy the rest of your evening, gentlemen." Then, without another word, he turned and walked out. And this time, when the door closed behind him, the restaurant erupted. Claps, cheers, a mix of shock, disbelief, and actual relief. David shook his head, exhaling. That did not just happen. Keanu chuckled, swirling the last sip of wine in his glass. "Oh, it happened." David leaned forward, still trying to process everything. "I can't believe it. I've been fighting cases like this my whole career. And tonight, I sit down for a steak, and suddenly," he gestured vaguely, "I get an apology from the chief of police." Keanu shrugged. "Right place, right time." David eyed him. "You think he would have done that if you weren't here?" Keanu smiled. "I think he did what he thought would save his ass." David smirked. "So, you're saying I should have dinner with you more often?" Keanu clinked his glass against David's. "I'm saying, if you ever need a +1 for a legal battle, you know where to find me." David laughed. For the first time that night, he felt it. Not just relief, not just gratitude, hope, and somewhere out in Los Angeles, Dalton, Grady, and Hendricks were realizing their careers would never be the same. As the applause settled, the restaurant slowly returned to normal. The waitstaff resumed their service, patrons whispered amongst themselves, and the tension that had gripped the room for the past hour finally started to fade. David leaned back in his chair, exhaling deeply. "I don't even know what to say, man." Keanu smirked, casually finishing his wine. "That's a first for a lawyer." David chuckled, shaking his head. "This whole night insane?" He glanced toward the door, where the chief of police had just left. "I mean, I've spent my career arguing cases, fighting this exact type of nonsense. And tonight, it actually played out differently." Keanu nodded, setting his glass down. "Because it had to." David frowned slightly. "What do you mean?" Keanu tilted his head toward the bar, where a few customers were still recording on their phones. This wasn't just another case. It wasn't a courtroom. It was public. David followed his gaze. People were still whispering, still buzzing about what had just happened. The difference between tonight and every other time this had happened? There were witnesses. Keanu tapped his fingers lightly on the table. They didn't care when it was just you. But when did people start watching? When did it become a scene? When suddenly, it wasn't just a misunderstanding, but a reputation risk. He shook his head. That's when they had to play nice. David exhaled through his nose. He knew Keanu was right. Still, Keanu continued, "I'd like to think the chief did the right thing because it was right, not just because it looked bad." David smirked. Optimistic. Keanu grinned. "Hollywood man." They both laughed, but there was a weight behind it. Because they both knew. For every night like this, there were 1,000 others that didn't end this way. David sat up straighter. "I'm not letting this go." Keanu raised an eyebrow. David's lawyer instincts were kicking in. Dalton and Grady? Hendricks? You think they're just going to let this slide? They're probably out there right now, rewriting the story, trying to flip the narrative. Keanu nodded. "You're probably right." David drummed his fingers against the table. "They'll say I was aggressive, that I refused to cooperate, that I made a scene, even though they were the ones harassing me." Keanu studied him for a moment, then reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. He tapped the screen a few times, then turned it around. David blinked. Keanu had been recording the whole thing. The moment Dalton and Grady approached. The moment Hendricks tried to force David outside. The moment the chief of police had to apologize. All of it. David let out a slow whistle. "Man, you were 2 steps ahead the whole time?" "Huh?" Keanu shrugged. "Let's just say in my line of work, I've learned how to recognize a script I've seen before." David grinned. "And you just so happened to be at the right place at the right time?" Keanu smirked. "Maybe." He slid the phone toward David. "Want the footage?" David didn't hesitate. "Oh yes." Keanu transferred the video, then leaned back, stretching his arms. So, what's next? David's eyes flickered with something sharp. Determination. Oh, I'm going to make sure this sticks, he said. Dalton and Grady are going to find out what it's like when someone fights back with more than just words. Keanu smiled approvingly. Good. David took a breath, looking at Keanu. I have to ask, though, why? Why step in? Why not just let it play out? Keanu was quiet for a moment. Then he said simply because someone had to. David studied him. The thing about Keanu Reeves? He wasn't a man who talked just to talk. He wasn't here for the spotlight. Wasn't here to prove anything. Wasn't here because it made him look good. He was just here because it was the right thing to do. David nodded. Well, I appreciate it. Keanu raised his glass one last time, to never back down. David clinked his glass against Keanu's, to make them regret it. They drank, and somewhere out in the city, 3 disgraced cops were realizing their careers were over.